The torches threw stretched shadows over the marble floor as she moved barefoot toward the carved wooden figure in the corner. Her fingers trembled. Behind her, 7 witnesses stood wordlessly, their faces lit by the dim lamps, their eyes tracking her with solemn attention. They had assured her this was custom, that every bride before her had taken the same steps, and that refusal would disgrace her family. Yet no one had truly told her what the custom demanded. Not until now. Not until the cloth was lifted, and she finally saw what lay beneath it. The year was 89 C. Under the rule of Emperor Domitian, 18-year-old Flavia Tirsa was about to learn that Roman marriage went far beyond saffron veils and tossed walnuts displayed at the public ceremony. What occurred in private, in a chamber filled with witnesses who could later swear before a court if needed, was something entirely different, something even Rome's own chroniclers struggled to describe, something the Christian church would later labor for centuries to wipe from memory. Before we move further, I'm honestly curious where you're listening from right now. It still amazes me that a ritual from 2 millennia ago can reach people across the globe today. Leave a comment and tell me. The wedding procession itself had been beautiful in its own way. Flavia had worn the flame-colored bridal veil, marking her new status. Her hair, arranged in 6 traditional braids tied with woolen ribbons, followed every requirement of custom. The sacrifice at the temple had gone well, the sheep's organs showing good omens. Her father had sealed the agreements that shifted her from his legal control into her husband's, using the old formula that made the union lawful under Roman rule. She had spoken the ritual phrase countless brides before had repeated, Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia, where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. The words meant she no longer existed independently. She now belonged to her husband, Marcus Petronius Rufus, a grain dealer 25 years older, whom she had met only 3 times before this day. But that ceremony had only marked the legal start. What waited at the end of the torchlit walk through the streets of Rome, inside the home she had never entered, in the chamber where witnesses already waited. That was where the real transformation would happen. That was where she would learn what Roman law truly demanded of a married woman's body. The crowds lining the path had chanted vulgar songs exactly as tradition required. The Fescennine verses were vulgar and bold, painting in crude detail what awaited her later that night. Young men in the crowd hurled comments that made her cheeks burn beneath the veil. Her mother had once said this was meant to chase away evil spirits through humiliation and laughter. But Flavia saw her mother was not smiling. She had cried while braiding Flavia's hair that morning, and her parting words had been whispered like a warning. Do not resist. Whatever they ask of you, do not resist. Resistance only makes it worse. They arrived at the house of Marcus Petronius Rufus, just as the last light faded from the sky. The entrance was draped with wool and greenery, 2 torches signaling that this was the place where a marriage would be sealed according to law. The crowd outside grew noisier, the verses more obscene. Someone tossed walnuts at her, the shells getting caught in the fold of her gown, a symbol of fertility that felt more like ridicule. Her husband waited in the doorway, and behind him she saw silhouettes shifting in the lamplight. Too many silhouettes, far too many for what should have been a private moment between husband and bride. Marcus lifted her across the threshold, as custom dictated, to prevent the ill luck of a stumble and echo of far older symbolism, one from a time when women were carried into their husbands' homes whether they agreed to enter or not. The door shut behind them, dulling the crude songs outside, and Flavia finally saw what waited in the atrium. An elderly woman in ceremonial dress, a praenuba charged with overseeing all that would take place that night, a priest whose exact affiliation was unclear, 3 female slaves holding basins and cloths, an older man with a leather satchel of medical tools set at his feet, and in the corner, covered with fabric that hid its true form, a wooden structure nearly 4 feet tall. The praenuba stepped forward and clasped Flavia's hands with a grip that was firm, almost restraining, as if she anticipated Flavia might try to escape. Welcome to your husband's household, the praenuba said. The sacred rites must now be fulfilled. Here is what almost no one tells you about Roman marriage. It was never primarily a bond of affection. It was a transfer of property, recorded and witnessed like the sale of a piece of land or ship. Roman law defined marriage as conventio in manum, literally coming into the hand, meaning a woman passed from her father's control into her husband's. In earlier centuries of the Republic, this transfer was absolute. A husband possessed the same legal authority over his wife that he held over his slaves, including, in theory, the power of life and death. By the imperial era, when Flavia walked that torchlit path, the rules had softened to a degree. Women could possess property. Divorce could occur under certain conditions. But the central principle stayed the same. Marriage shifted a woman from one man's authority into another's. And like every major property transfer in Rome, it demanded verification. Think of how Romans conducted the sale of land. Witnesses were present to oversee the act. The property was inspected to confirm it matched the seller's claims. Rituals invoked the gods to bless the exchange. Boundaries were paced, documents sealed, and everyone involved understood precisely what was being traded. The Romans applied identical reasoning to marriage, with one crucial difference. The bride's chief value lay in her ability to create legitimate offspring. Her body was the asset being exchanged. Her fertility was a resource being secured. And Roman law required that both be confirmed before the transaction could be deemed complete. This is not interpretation. Roman legal sources clearly state that a marriage was not valid until consummation occurred. The consummation had to be witnessed because otherwise, how could anyone be sure it had happened? The bride's virginity had to be proven because otherwise, how could a husband guarantee that future children were truly his? Each legal demand produced its own ritual. Rituals that were entirely logical within Roman reasoning. Rituals that repel modern sensibilities precisely because that reasoning is so foreign to how we understand marriage today. The Pronuba led Flavia toward the draped object in the corner. Flavia's heartbeat pounded so violently she could hear it echoing in her skull. The Pronuba's hand stayed on her arm, steady, insistent, leaving no chance for retreat. "You must greet mutinous to Tunis," the Pronuba said. "You must ask for his blessing before your husband comes near you. You must offer yourself as tradition commands." Flavia lifted her shaking hands and pulled away the fabric. What stood beneath was a wooden figure carved with exact anatomical detail into the shape of a phallus. But this was no small charm like the amulets worn by children to ward off harm. This was no garden guardian meant to frighten thieves. This figure was measured deliberately, shaped precisely for a specific purpose, one that became sickeningly clear as the Pronuba began to explain what Flavia was expected to do. The god Mutinus Tutinus was Rome's deity of fertility and sexual initiation. We know he existed because several ancient authors mention him, always briefly, always with unease. St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century as Christianity overtook pagan Rome, described the ritual with indignation. Roman brides, he said, were required to sit upon the wooden phallus of Mutinus Tutinus as a sacred obligation before consummating the marriage. The act was carried out in front of witnesses. Augustine was a hostile commentator intent on denouncing pagan worship, yet his account matches fragments from earlier non-Christian writings that refer to the same custom. Lactantius, another church author, called it so disgraceful that even speaking of it defiled the one who uttered the words. Arnobius offered the fullest description, portraying brides being placed upon the god's emblem while their new husbands looked on. The antiquarian Varro, writing centuries earlier with no Christian motive, mentioned Mutinus Tutinus as a god to whom brides were presented, using wording that strongly implied physical contact without stating it outright. Modern historians who mention the rite at all often soften it, suggesting the bride merely sat for a moment on the statue's lap as a symbolic gesture. But the language of the ancient sources does not comfortably support that interpretation. Augustine used the verb insidir, meaning to sit down upon, mount, or settle onto. Arnobius employed expressions that suggest penetration. Lactantius refused to describe the details because they were too shameful, which seems an extreme reaction if the act were truly only a light symbolic touch. The stated purpose was to ask divine favor for fertility. The practical purpose, whether the Romans consciously acknowledged it or not, was preparation. It was designed to break resistance before the true consummation. It was a demonstration of complete submission before witnesses. It was a way to condition a virgin bride to accept what must follow. Flavia stood before the figure. The Pronuba positioned her, guided her movements, told her exactly what she must do. The witnesses watched, Her husband watched. The physician waited nearby to perform his inspection afterward, and in that moment Flavia understood what her mother's tears had meant, what the obscene songs outside had been preparing her for, what Roman marriage truly demanded. She could, in theory, refuse. But refusal meant humiliation for her family, cancellation of the marriage contracts, and a return to her father's house as spoiled goods no respectable man would take. It meant everything she had been taught about virtue and honor would collapse, and she herself would be left disgraced. So she did not refuse. When the ritual with the statue was finished, the slaves bathed her with scented water. The washing held religious meaning, purifying her after her encounter with the god, but it also prepared her physically for what came next, the medical examination. The physician, who had stood silently to the side, now stepped forward. This examination was not optional. Before any marriage that involved meaningful property, a respectable Roman bride was required to undergo verification by a physician or midwife to confirm her virginity. The examination was recorded, and that record became part of the legal documentation defining the bride's value. Roman medical writers described their methods with a clinical precision that leaves no doubt about what the process entailed. This initial pre-wedding inspection created a baseline. The bride was certified as intact, as never having belonged to another man. Now, after the ritual with mutinous tutinus, the physician carried out a second inspection. This confirmed that the ritual had been fully performed, that her condition aligned with the results of the earlier assessment, that she was physically ready for consummation with her husband. All of this took place in front of witnesses whose testimony could later be required if any element of the marriage was brought into legal dispute. What shocks modern readers about Roman accounts is not only their invasiveness, but their utter casualness. The Romans did not see these procedures as traumatic or inappropriate. They were simply necessary steps in completing a significant legal exchange. The bride's discomfort at being examined, watched, and recorded held no more weight than the feelings of a field being measured before purchase. Property does not feel. Property is transferred under the correct procedures. Once the examination ended, Flavia was taken to the bridal chamber prepared for consummation. The room had been decorated according to custom, with a marriage bed positioned so that it was fully visible from the doorway, which would remain open all night. Oil lamps gave enough light for the pronuba to watch from her place near the entrance. The servants who would be needed afterward waited in the corridor. Marcus entered. He looked uneasy, something that startled Flavia. She had expected confidence, authority. Instead, he glanced awkwardly toward the pronuba before moving toward the bed. The pronuba spoke, her tone formal and ceremonial. The bride is prepared. The gods have blessed this union. Let the marriage be consummated according to the laws of Rome and the customs of our ancestors. Let witnesses affirm its completion. Let none dispute that this woman has become a wife. What followed lasted several hours. The pronuba watched the entire time, occasionally offering instruction to ensure the consummation fulfilled every legal expectation. The door stayed open. Sounds carried into the hall, where the slaves waited. Everything that occurred on that bed was semi-public. Part of verification ritual intended to guarantee that no detail of the property transfer could later be contested. At dawn, the physician returned for a final inspection. This final inspection confirmed that consummation had taken place, that the bride's body had changed in ways marking her passage from maiden to wife. The findings were recorded. The pronuba gave her official testimony, describing what she had observed. With that, the legal transformation was finished. Flavia Tertia was now a Roman wife. Over the next 10 years, she would bear 4 children. She would oversee her husband's household with competence. She would attend festivals and perform every obligation expected of a matron of her rank. And she would never speak of her wedding night, not even to her own daughters when their marriages were arranged, because what could she possibly say? It was tradition. It was the way things had always been. It was simply what Roman marriage demanded. Her silence was not unusual. It was universal. Roman women did not write about their wedding nights. Roman men did not describe what they had seen. These rituals were so woven into Roman life that explaining them felt unnecessary, like describing how one sleeps or breathes. Everyone understood. No one spoke. This is why reconstructing these customs requires gathering fragments from hostile Christian writers, obscure legal notes, reluctant medical texts, and archaeological evidence whose meaning becomes clear only when their purpose is known. The silence was not a secret plot. It was merely a sign of how deeply normalized these practices were. They were the cultural environment Roman women lived in, so constant and unquestioned that describing them seemed needless. For 1,000 years, this was a Roman model of marriage. Generations of women experienced their wedding nights within this framework, interpreted their roles through this logic, and passed quiet warnings to their daughters, ensuring the cycle continued. The system endured because all participants accepted its central assumptions. Property must be verified. Transfers must be witnessed. Marriage creates legal responsibilities that require documentation, and women are the vessels through which families endure. The logic was internally coherent, even while it appears outwardly horrifying. Its end came not from reform within Rome, but from the rise of a new religion. When Christianity reshaped Roman society in the 4th and 5th centuries, it introduced entirely different principles. If women possessed souls equal to men, they could not be treated as property subject to inspection. If marriage was a holy sacrament, it could not contain rituals the church considered obscene. If modesty and privacy were virtues, the entire system of witnesses and verification was intolerable. The transition lasted centuries and was never perfectly complete, but in cities and among the educated, the old practices were steadily driven out, and the destruction included erasing their traces. Statues of mutinous tutinus were shattered or buried. Texts describing wedding night rites were removed from libraries or left to rot. Wall paintings showing the old customs were whitewashed. The role of the prenupo was stripped of its earlier duties and turned into something purely symbolic. Within a few generations, detailed understanding of what Roman weddings had truly included faded, from everyone except scholars parsing the fragmented surviving records. The Christians who reshaped Rome were not merely wiping away an awkward past. They were attempting to construct a new civilization on Roman foundations while rejecting what those foundations had once upheld. They succeeded so thoroughly that most people today have no real sense of what Roman marriage actually entailed. The pleasant myth of saffron veils and tossed walnuts replaced the uncomfortable truth. But traces remain. Traces always remain. Flavia died in the year 131 CE at roughly age 60. She had lived as a wife for more than 40 years. What did she feel about her wedding night over all those decades that followed? Did she carry it as trauma, as resignation, as something in between? Did she hope for something different for her daughters? Or did she simply accept that this was the order of the world? We cannot know. She left behind no writings. No Roman woman of her rank did. The silence around these customs is the silence of women whose experiences were not deemed worth preserving, whose emotions about their own bodies were not considered relevant to the histories and legal records men created. We know what was done to them. We do not know what they felt about what was done, but we know enough to grasp why this history was buried. It exposed something unsettling about the civilization we inherited. Rome is supposed to be the backbone of Western law and culture. Acknowledging what Rome actually imposed on its women complicates that legacy. It shows that civilization and cruelty can exist. Together, that legal brilliance can stand beside systematic dehumanization. The wedding night rituals of Rome have vanished, but the women who endured them were real. For Flavia Tertia, for her mother, for her daughters, for all the generations of Roman women whose wedding nights were ceremonies of verification and control. They lived, they endured, they were silenced,